Nice to see my good friend Tom Lawson here today. I first met him when I was an undergraduate. He was the first true cognitive scientist I ever encountered and was formative in putting me on the path to where I am today. So in brief outline, I'll start with a very brief focused introduction to phonology, and in particular on the significance of paradigmatic information as being information about the structure of phonology. And then I'll give a brief overview of optimality theory, which is sort of the leading theoretical framework for characterizing phonologies. Those two things will be enough to have a sense of the formal structure of the situation that I'm dealing with, and I'll point to what that sets up in terms of learning phonologies, the kinds of issues that a learner has to overcome in dealing with phonologies. After that, I'll get into the theory of a more recent development about a structure in phonology called output-driven maps, and then finally show how that structure has a big impact on the ability to efficiently learn a phonology. So in terms of questions, I guess I'll just keep an ear out. Somebody can sort of speak up. I'm not always very good at watching the chat while I'm talking. So
we just speak, Bruce. So you don't have to worry about keeping an eye on the chat.
Okay. So phonology is the study of the sound patterns of possible human languages. And there are many dimensions and phenomena along which that goes. Today, I'll be focusing on two, specifically two properties of vowels, stress and vowel length. So stress can mean somewhat different related things in different languages, but roughly we can think of it as the degree of emphasis that's placed on a given vowel, and it can be implemented in a variety of different phonetic ways. So if we consider a couple of English words, colony, that first vowel, col, is where the main stress is on that word, colony. If we take a related word, colonial, it's the second vowel upon which main stress is falling. And so part of phonology is determining where stress falls in different words when they're produced. Stress can be completely predictable in some languages. So in a language like Czech, the first syllable of every word is stressed. And that's all there is to say about stress in Czech. You know, it's always predictable, always in the same position. There are other languages where stress can vary, not just on the phonological context, but can be specified as part of the identity of a word where stress occurs. That's what would be called lexical stress. So Spanish is an example of a case where stress can be lexically specified. You could have two words that are otherwise the same that potentially could be distinguished by where stress lands in the word.
So Bruce, can I ask a very basic question? So what is the physical definition of stress? Is this how much effort the speaker is putting in to produce that sound, or can it be measured in some way?
The phonetic realization of stress can vary somewhat across languages. So if you're talking to someone who's working more at the phonetic level, they'll say stress is not one, but a number of things. It's characterized often by increased amplitude, elongation of the vowel often goes along with stress, and there are some other things. Some languages express stress more in terms of what's known as a pitch accent. There's a certain kind of feature of the modulation of the pitch that occurs that points it out. So when you're talking to a phoneticist, they might talk in different languages about the realizations of these things. However, the pattern of where these things occur have remarkably similar properties across languages, even if the phonetic implementation is somewhat different. So a phonologist will tend to talk more abstractly about things like prosodic heads as being places that are amplified in this way.
I see. So if I were to give you a raw audio signal of somebody speaking, perhaps in a language that you are unfamiliar with, you would be objectively able to tell which parts of the audio signal or which sections are these stressed ones?
It would depend on the case. It might not be always obvious if you're not a speaker of that language. The precise way in which it's realized can vary somewhat from language to language.
So it could just be like a deviation from the norm would be a stress.
Right. Not just any deviation. There are particular dimensions along which it happens. But it's, like I said, there's a limited range of dimensions that commonly correlate with it.
Great. Thank you.
Can I ask a question regarding natural accents? Asking for a friend here.
About which?
Accents. Is it that an accent is basically a shift of word stress in any given word? So that a foreigner like myself might accentuate mimics the stress of the native language, of the mother tongue, rather than the learned language. I hope that makes sense. Is that what?
If you're talking about an accent of a non-native speaker,
yeah, that's what I mean.
Then stress is one of many things that could be affected by the person's native phonology when speaking a second language. So sometimes, yes, you will see, just as with other kinds of phonological phenomena, you will see stress land in a different location than the native language would put it. And that is, in all likelihood, an influence of the native language that you speak.
Thank you.
So for the purposes of today, I'm going to just take stress as being something that's realized and identifiable. And the notation that I'll typically use, which is common, certainly not universal, but common in the field, is to use an acute accent mark to indicate where stress is. So in the word colony, we have the vowel that's stressed with the acute accent on it, and then colonial, we see stresses on the second vowel in the language, or in the word. Now, vowel length refers to the roughly to the duration of time of the vowel. And in languages that have differences in vowel length, you have a long vowel is typically something like twice as long as the short vowel. And it's, while there are certainly limits on what those durations are like, they vary quite a bit. So it's as much the relative proportion of the length of short vowels to long vowels that's more relevant than any absolute number of milliseconds, which is why the contrast can be preserved in rapid speech and slow speech. It scales down, and exactly how long a long vowel is can be dependent on phonetic effects as within a particular instance of a long vowel, as well as with the contrast with the length of a short vowel. So in English, commonly you get vowels that are stressed are often longer. That's not universal across vowels, but vowels that aren't stressed are more likely to be reduced, which among other things means that they're shortened. So if we look at short vowels, if we take the word colony, that second vowel is reduced. So instead of a full O, it's actually coming out as and it's relatively short. So colony, this vowel here is a short vowel. If we look at the same vowel in the word colonial that shifts stress onto it, instead of colony, it's colonial. And if you measure it, that instance of the vowel is significantly longer than that instance of the vowel. It's not just the length that's changing because it's English, so vowel quality is changing as well. If we look at the first vowel, we get just the opposite. It's long in the case of colony, and it shortens when we say colonial. First vowel is significantly shorter. And again, the significance of vowel length varies across different languages. So there are some languages like Polish in which there simply are no long vowels. So there aren't any phonologically significant differences in vowel duration. Vowels are roughly the same in length. There are others that go so far as to use it lexically to distinguish one thing from another, like Japanese, where vowel length could be the one thing that distinguishes one word from another, is whether a particular vowel is held long or short. In terms of notation, I'll be using a colon to denote a long vowel. So in this case, if we take colony, I'll be showing that that vowel is long and the second vowel without the colon on it is short. So I'm going to, for purposes of today, boil down phonology to those two properties, stress and length. And that's turns out for illustration be a convenient pair because they're capable of functioning independently, but in some grammars they also interact with each other, which makes life interesting when you're trying to do grammar learning. So words are built from morphemes. So if we look at the word colonial, it's built out of two parts. There's a noun root, colony, and there's a suffix, al, whose primary effect is to convert a noun to an adjective. So you take the noun colony and put al at the end, and then you get the adjective colonial. And when it comes to the pronunciation of the word, the underlying representation of the pronunciation information for colony, for the root, and for the suffix are combined together, and the phonology determines how that combination should be pronounced. Okay, and that fact that we're building words out of pieces and thus building the pronunciations of words from the pronunciation information of the pieces is of central significance. So the sound portion of a morpheme, a meaning-bearing unit of a word, is commonly said to be expressed in terms of stored phonological features. And so we're going to be interested primarily in vowels today. And so a vowel will have a stress feature, a length feature. Those are the ones I'll be talking about today, and numerous other features as well that describe the different properties that characterize a particular vowel. Features are binary. So it's quite common to, in phonology, to describe features in terms of a plus value and a minus value. You could get a completely isomorphic system if you describe them as a 1 value and a 0 value or anything like that. What matters is the opposition of the two values. So for a stress feature, I'll be using plus to represent it being marked as being stressed and minus to represent it being unstressed. And for vowel length, plus will represent a long vowel and minus will represent a short vowel. And so a given segment, where we think of the segments as the individual sound units, can be thought of essentially as a vector of phonological feature values. So in what I'm talking about today, we'll be thinking of a vector of two features, a stress feature and a length feature. And that's what we're saying about a particular segment, characterizes its properties, phonologically speaking.
Bruce, can I ask a question that a step back from this information? So
sure.
The baseline question is, what is the teleology, or what is the purpose of these stresses? So if the utterances were devoid of any of these modifications of stress and length, what would we lose?
So what's the purpose of indicating the different values at all?
Yeah, so if you had, say, a text-to-speech system that was not creating these stresses or elongations of vowels, would the speech that's produced, would it be less comprehensible to a listener?
Well, yes, in a word, it would be much less comprehensible to the extent that those features are used to realize, the differences between one word and another. And I'm describing a basic picture here, but many of these features are tied up. so there's a lot of complexity, of course, that I'm simplifying away from today. So things like stress are involved in a lot of other properties in language as well. So what I'm talking about today is word stress. So any what we call a lexical word has a main stress somewhere in it. I'm not talking about secondary stress, which is a level of stress in between main stress and unstressed, which can serve to help give a sense of the rhythmic pace of the language. But then there are additional stress levels that are at the phrasal level. And where a higher level, phrasal level of stress goes is determined often in part by the syntactic structure of the phrase. If the phrase is built out of several words, you'll find that the phrasal stress is limited to within a certain domain of a phrase. And so that's information telling you what the phrasal structure is of the sentence when you identify where the stresses are and what the constituent structure is of it. What the most prominent or controlling portion of the phrase is often where that stress is gonna land. With some variety. There are also other functional properties that are used with stress in some cases. For instance, there's contrastive stress, where you put an extra stress on a word because it's playing a particular function, like if it's under focus. You can say, I went to the store, or if you want to emphasize that you went one place, went another, I went to the store, where that stress on store wouldn't be the sort of neutral or default stress, but for the semantic and pragmatic reasons, you're putting a sort of a high level of stress there. And if store is a multisyllable word, that stress on that word then goes down onto whichever vowel within that word is bearing the main word stress. That's the particular vowel that accent will land on top of. So there are a variety of things like that that all of these properties play into. And if you just wipe a signal clean of that and listen to it, you'll notice immediately.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, so a morpheme, you can think of a morpheme as sort of two parts. There's the morphosyntactic part, which says something about the part of speech that a morpheme is, and there's the phonological part, which is the part involved with its sound structure, its pronunciation. And so the sound structure part is what I'll be referring to as an underlying form. So a morpheme consists of a sequence of segments, and each of those segments we can think of as a feature vector. So we're thinking, for each of the segments in it, we're only concerned with vowels at the moment, and for each of those we're looking at two features, just stress and length. In general, there are many more features for both the consonants and the vowels, and you just have a sequence of such feature vectors. When morphemes are combined to form a word, the underlying forms are concatenated, and that forms the input for the word. So the key thing is that each morpheme has information about its sound structure underlyingly, but that isn't the end of the story in terms of how it's pronounced. Things then get fed through the core phonology, and that determines, possibly altered, what the actual surface pronunciation is. So the morphemes for a word are put together, their underlying forms are put together to determine an input, and then that input is fed into the phonological map. And so the map is a function, and it's a function from the space of representable inputs to the space of representable outputs. So the pronunciation of a word is determined by constructing the input and then feeding that input into the map to get the output. And the output is at least the phonological approximation to what you actually hear. And so the map embodies all of the core generalizations of the phonology. Okay, there are restrictions on what sounds can go together, in what ways things should be patterned, and the map is responsible for enforcing those things. And enforcing those things, if necessary, means making changes to the way things are structured in the input, so they come out a little differently in the output. So this is the system I'll be using for illustrating things for the rest of the talk today, building on our two features, stress and vowel length. I'm going to be working in a system where there are two words, one root and one, each word is built by combining a root and a suffix. All the roots are going to look like variations of pa. All that's going to vary is the vowel. The vowel can be stressed or unstressed and can be long or short. The P is just along for the ride to make it easy to tell what a root is. It has a P consonant, which we don't do anything with. Suffix is just going to be variations on ka. Again, we're just concerned with the vowel. The K is along for the ride just to show you that it's a suffix. Each vowel has two features. And so each root is just a single syllable, so it has one vowel, and each suffix is a single syllable, so it just has one vowel. So the underlying form for each morpheme consists of just the two vowel features. So if we're looking at the underlying form for, say, the root pa, where the vowel is short and unstressed, we have two features and they're minus minus. So the order in which these little vectors are always given is the stress feature first, then the length feature. This is how we would represent something that is unstressed but long. And the featural representation for that would be minus stress plus long. So this is plus stress but short. So plus stress minus long. And likewise, this is a root that is both stressed and long. So those are the four possible underlying forms for a morpheme. And so those are the four possibilities for a root, and those are the four possibilities for a suffix. Okay, so keeping things nice and simple. When we form an input by picking some particular root and some particular suffix and combining them together, we take the underlying forms of those two morphemes and concatenate them together to get an input. And so we can understand that input effectively as this sequence of four feature values. Now I've written it flat just as four feature values because in what's upcoming, that'll make it a little easier to parse. Really, you can think of this as each of pair of things being a feature vector for a particular vowel. So those first two features here, those are for the root vowel. And the second two feature values there, those are the features for the suffix vowel. And you'll have to pardon my handwriting here. Okay, so that's what determines an input. And we get the output, how the word is actually pronounced, by feeding that input into the phonological map. Now, part of the structural properties of our system are that outputs are more restricted than inputs. Inputs are sort of combinatorially determined. You can have any sequence of vowels you want, which means an input with two vowels, there could be zero stresses in the input. One of the two vowels could be stressed, or both vowels could be stressed. Outputs, on the other hand, are subject to phonological restrictions. And one universal phonological restriction is that stress is culminative. That is, there is exactly one stressed vowel in the output. So every word has exactly one vowel that receives main stress. So example outputs here, you notice they're restricted to a set of words where there is exactly one stress. In some cases, it's on the root vowel. In other cases, it's on the suffix vowel. But you can't have two stressed vowels in an output. You can't have no stressed vowels in an output. There's exactly one stress. And so inputs with zero stresses or two stresses are going to get modified by the phonological map in determining the output. In other words, maps can neutralize. So here neutralize means you can have two different inputs which end up going to the same output. So we could have an input here where we have two short vowels and stress on the root, and that surfaces with two short vowels and stress on the root. We could also have an input with two short vowels and they're both stressed underlyingly. And a particular phonology might make that surface as just stress on the root. So two different inputs underlyingly, but they're surfacing with the same pronunciation. Okay, for that particular phonology, those two inputs are neutralized to the same output. This makes life interesting for learning because, of course, learning is going the other direction, taking what's in the output and trying to recover what the input is.
And
Now, the
sorry,
form, yes.
So I'm almost totally blank, so I can't see any of your writing. To make sure I'm following, the inputs have 16 possible configurations. The output has only 4 possible configurations. And there's different mappings of that 16 to 4 that are allowable. I'm forgetting the cool word that you're using, not phenomenology. What is it?
Phonology.
Phonology. Like, so of the 16 to 4 mapping, you can have a bunch of different options, and we don't yet know which one is real or.
Well, right. This is describing what the range of representations are like cross-linguistically. Different individual languages will allow some and not others on the output side. The space of possibilities on the input side is the same universally. Every phonological map has the same range of possible inputs, but what kinds of outputs it permits will vary from language to language. The space of outputs that it has to choose from, you can have exactly one stress on the first vowel or the second vowel, and you can have length. Each vowel independently can be either long or short. So the first vowel can be long or short, the second vowel can be long or short, and then there could be stress on the first syllable or the second. So you get a total of 8 possible output forms.
Right. Okay.
But you're right, 16 possible inputs.
Thank you.
Okay. Is everything else at least roughly clear?
Yeah, surprisingly to me.
Okay.
So,
So the formal structure governing the map, that is the function that maps inputs to outputs, is what's known as optimality theory. And so this is going to be sort of my compressed 1-slide introduction to optimality theory. So in optimality theory, if you're given a particular input, the theory maps that input to a space of possible outputs. In fact, you'll notice here I've listed essentially all of the outputs, all 8 possibilities. And those 8 possibilities are called candidates, and you can think of them as sort of competing to be the actual output. And the actual output is determined through optimization. The optimization is with respect to a set of constraints which evaluate each candidate. I'll say more about the content of the constraints in a minute. What we have here is known as a classic tableau. Given this input for each of these possible outputs, each of the subsequent columns, there are 6 of them, represent a constraint. Okay, a constraint is just something that has evaluates a particular candidate. And in this table, everywhere you see an asterisk, that corresponds to a violation of the constraint. Okay, so this third candidate down violates this first constraint. WSP stands for weight to stress principle once. This candidate here violates ident stress twice. And the goal is to find the candidate that does the best job of satisfying the constraints. Okay, so you want to, in some sense, minimize the constraint violations. Now, one of the things that makes optimality theory distinct is the way it handles conflicts among the constraints. So it doesn't, well, first notice that there is not a single row, there's not a single candidate here with 0 constraint violations, and that's the norm. In most circumstances, it's not possible to satisfy all the constraints. There are various conflicts between the constraints that arise. So you have to do the best you can. That's why optimization is called for. But the resolving the conflicts between the constraints in optimality theory is not a matter of numeric optimization. That is, we don't assign weights to the constraints and add them up to a measure and compare the measure. Instead, it's a kind of optimization known as lexicographic optimization. Now, if you're not familiar with that term or that sounds a little esoteric, don't worry. You know what lexicographic optimization is. You just don't know it by that name. It's basically the same principle that you use when you alphabetize books by, say, the author's last name. When you alphabetize books, you look at the first letter of each of the last names, and you relate them on an order, the order in which the letters occur in the alphabet. And what comes first are all those books that have the earliest letter in the order. So maybe there are 3 authors whose name begins with B, and there are no authors whose name begins with A, and others begin with a later letter. Then those 3 whose names start with B occur before all the others. And then the tie among those B authors, you go to the next letter in the name, and you compare those values with respect to the order. That's lexicographic optimization. So in the case of optimality theory, you take the constraints and you impose an order on them. So the constraints are ordered kind of in the same sense that the letters of a person's name are ordered: first letter, second letter, third letter, fourth letter, and so forth. And then the within that constraint, the candidates are ordered by the number of violations they have, with 0 being the best, 1 being the next best, 2 the next best, and so forth. So if I were to take the 6 constraints here and treat them as ordered in the order in which they're shown in the table left to right, that would mean that the highest rank constraint is WSP, and I would look at all the candidates and say, okay, what's the lowest level of violation we get? And the answer is there are some candidates that have 0 violations. That means that any candidate which has 1 or more violations of that first constraint can't win the competition. It's eliminated at that point. So that would be that candidate out, that candidate out, that candidate out, and that candidate out. So after the first constraint, we have 4 candidates still in the running that have 0 violations of WSP. So we go down to the next constraint in the ranking. So now we're looking at ident stress, and we see of the 4 remaining candidates, there are 2 that have 0 violations and 2 that have 2 violations. So the 2 with 0 violations are still in the race, and the other 2 are eliminated. So we're down to 2 candidates. Now we move down to the third constraint. Each of our 2 remaining candidates has 1 violation, so that doesn't distinguish them. Okay, they both have the same minimal level of violation of the candidates that remain, so that doesn't determine anything. The next constraint, they have 0 violations, so that doesn't determine everything. We go to the next constraint in the ranking, and the first candidate has 1 violation, the second candidate has 2. And at that point, the second candidate is eliminated, and the output is determined. So for that input in the upper left-hand corner, with this ranking of the constraints, that is the output. So the difference between the 2, the input has stress on the second vowel. The output keeps the stress on the second vowel. However, it shortens the first vowel. So it made a change between the input and the output.
Could you go? So, first of all, where do these constraints come from? Is it sort of language specific in the ordering of the constraints? And also, could you go through what each of these mean, these constraints, like WSP? I think you mentioned that before, but I forget what it was.
Right. So the 6 constraints, roughly in terms of their meaning, what was ML is main left, and that's a constraint on where the stress should go. So the main left constraint says stress should go on the initial syllable. Main right is the same kind of idea in the other direction. Stress should go on the last syllable. You know, and those are sort of the only 2 choices it looks like when you're dealing with 2-syllable words. But when you start dealing with 6- and 7-syllable words, the definitions of these constraints don't change, and they reflect that in general, even with longer words, many languages have strong preferences for edge attentiveness of stress. They tend to be close to the beginning or close to the end. The third constraint, no long, is offended by any long vowel that appears on the surface. Okay, so it just says, I would prefer that there be no long vowels if it was up to that constraint. So as you might imagine, if you're a Polish speaker, that constraint's going to be relatively highly ranked and largely responsible for why there are no long vowels in the language. WSP is short for weight to stress principle. And what that means is that if a vowel is long, it should be stressed. So it's violated by a long vowel that doesn't receive stress. Okay, and so it's expressing within the constraint the strong tendency, how strong varies across languages, to combine vowel length and stress. Again, in some languages, that's a very common process. You have lengthening of vowels in stress position. In some cases, that won't figure into the system we have here, but you also get shortening in non-stress position, which we will see in the system today. Those four constraints, as I've described them, are opinions on what output should look like. Okay, that's sort of the core substance of phonology in general. It says these are what should make for good outputs. And they're expressions of general tendencies across phonologies in the languages of the world. The other two constraints are known as faithfulness constraints, and they govern the relationship between the input and the output. And so as the name might suggest, a faithfulness constraint is sort of opposed to any change. It wants the output to be faithful to the input. So anytime you change something in the output from the way it was in the input, you get a violation of a faithfulness constraint. So ident stress is violated anytime the output version of a vowel has a different value of its stress feature from the input version of the vowel. Ident length is violated whenever the output version of a vowel has a different length feature value from the input version of the vowel. And so at the top level, that's sort of the most coarse and apparent tension between the constraints. The first four constraints, what are, to linguists are known as markedness constraints, are constraints on the outputs. They want outputs to meet certain canonical forms, which means they want you, when necessary, to change things in order to meet those conditions. And the faithfulness constraints oppose changing things. And so phonology, a particular phonology, ranking of the constraints, is a way of trading off those sets of concerns. Okay, does that make sense for the content of the constraints? What those names mean?
Yeah, I have one follow-up on this. What dictates the order of these six constraints? Why do you start with WSP? Yeah.
Yep. So the larger picture in optimality theory is that the space of inputs and candidates are universal. Okay, so that function, both its domain, which is the representable inputs, and its codomain, the space of representable outputs, are universal. Every human language has the same set of inputs and outputs. And the constraints as well are universal. So building a theory of phonology is building a theory of what the constraints are. What varies across languages is the ranking of the constraints, the order in which the constraints occur. And so the typological predictions of a particular phonological theory are, you predict that to be a possible human language, a particular pattern, a particular phonology must correspond to at least one total ranking of your constraints. So when all's going well, your prediction about what the possible phonologies of human languages are the languages that result from all possible rankings of the same set of universal constraints. And that's how you empirically investigate different proposals. Is you posit a theory, you look at what the predictions are in terms of what kinds of phonological phenomena you should see, what kinds of phonological phenomena are predicted to not be possible, and then you look at the data of the world's languages and see how well they comport to each other.
I ask, when you say language, I'm inferring that you have a different definition than English as a language, because like dialects and accents might have different rankings, right?
So in general, I'm using language to mean something like variety of speech.
Okay. Yeah.
So as is well known to people within the linguistic community, the difference between a language, between two things which are different languages, and between two things that are said to be dialects of the same language, that has much more to do with politics, social identity, and historical development than it does with any objective property of one manner of speech versus another. So when I'm using language, I'm talking about the production of a particular grammar. So yes, in general, anytime you have two varieties of speech spoken by two different native speakers and there's something substantive about the sound pattern that they have that's different, then I would call those, in the limit, two different languages. And we would account for that with two different grammars. Even if those grammars are largely similar, the difference between them should be accounted for by some difference in the phonological grammars.
Thank you.
Can I ask a clarification about the typology?
Sure.
Is that similar to what we refer to as families of languages, or?
Well, in this case, typology just means the range of possibilities. What's commonly referred to as family of languages is overwhelmingly concerned with the historical development of languages. So languages are usually grouped into the similar language families. At least that's where the term gets used most of the time, if they are historically related, relatively recently. So your Romance languages all, developed from Latin, say, that would form a family of sorts. And then you get hierarchical structure as different things branch off into different other modern ways of speaking. And so not surprisingly, a collection of languages that are recently historically related will have a number of properties in common, but they differ in a variety of ways. And some of the properties in which they differ from other languages in their family it'll be a property they share with certain other languages that are historically in entirely different language families. So as languages change over time, there are a recurring set of properties that are just among the possibilities in languages, and they pop up repeatedly in different groups of languages, even if they're historically rather far apart from each other. Now, does that answer your question?
It answers my question that typology is not family of languages. But can you then say again what constitutes a typology?
Typology is a prediction about what the possible languages are. Or the way it goes essentially is the theory tells you what the possible grammars are. Each grammar generates a language. And so you look at the languages that can possibly be generated. That's the typology predicted by the theory. It's sort of like the inventory of possible phonological things that can happen.
Okay.
And I think related to that, so in this dimension reduction of language, we are losing, we're ignoring consonants and even the particular vowels. So in this subset of data, if I were to classify English speakers of a particular vowel duration and stress and Hindi speakers, and they happen to have a dialect of those two human languages have the same presentation and stress and duration of vowels, those would be a typology of it could be this variant of Hindi or this variant of English.
You could make it line up. Now, the system I'm using for illustration here is, of course, I'm simplifying over a ton of details that would go on if you were to try to do a large-scale description of, complete natural languages. Yeah. So yes, you could take the languages and the typology of the system I've just described and roughly map them to certain other languages that would have those properties. There, some in which there are no long vowels, some in which stress and length function independently, some in which vowels which aren't stressed are always short, and match those to a variety of languages. It's certainly, that wouldn't be everything there is to say about either stress or length in any of those languages. But the range of possibilities that are described here would roughly map onto a variety of the world's languages, yes.
Yeah, cool, thank you. And yeah, understood that this is a beautiful, it's an example I can wrap my head around, which I appreciate.
Right. And the idea is that, analyses which have, bitten off far more detail and their interactions with each other, when you add the other details, you're taking sort of some of the assumptions of the system and you're adding to them. So you would have the constraints that are given here, and you'd be adding other constraints to govern some of the other dimensions of representation that you're including. That is, as soon as you add another detail, you don't throw out these constraints and start fresh and have a different set of ones. So the system I just described with the range of inputs and outputs and the 6 constraints yields, when you crank it out, a typology of 24 languages. There are 24 different possible input-output maps that can be determined. And I very imaginatively have labeled these languages L1, L2, L3 through L24. And so the case I'm going to focus on, because it's one of the particularly interesting ones, is L20. And so this is the full paradigm structure for L20. So R1 is, I've got 4 possible root underlying forms. So again, I will imaginatively call them R1, R2, R3, and R4. And so R1 is the root in which the vowel is short and unstressed. S3, for instance, is the suffix in which the suffix is short but stressed underlyingly. So if we put those two things together, the input we get hopefully that's visible, would look like that. Just the concatenation of those two inputs. And in this case, the output we get looks pretty similar. So that part of the table, that is the output for R1S3 in language L20. So the assignment of the underlying forms, is shown here for R1, R2, R3, R4, S1, S2, S3, S4. Those are the possibilities. Those labels will stay the same, but the content of the inner part of the box, those are the outputs. Those will change as the ranking changes. So this particular language, L20, is the result of this particular ranking of the constraints. And just descriptively, what's going on in this language? Well, it's a lexical stress language in that stress isn't always initial and isn't always final. So you can find, words, in fact, even with all short vowels, where stress is initial, and words where stress is final. So we know there's something going on in the input that can affect where stress goes, which tells us that faithfulness to stress in the input, ID stress, must be active. It's having an effect, at least in some places.
Can I ask another question regarding the ranking?
Sure.
Are there languages where the ranking order has an within variance? So where you don't see for all contexts or for all sentences which can be spoken always the same ranking? Or is that what makes any language unique?
In general, there'll be it depends a certain amount on the language, but when life gets complicated, you'll find that there are some languages that take their lexicon and break them into a few groups. And you'll get what has at least sometimes been described as co-phonologies, or different rankings for the different groups of words. So a well-studied example is the Japanese lexicon, where there's a ranking for native words that are sort of historically native Japanese, and then the phonology shifts a little differently for certain classes of words that were borrowed a long time ago, but form a sort of coherent subset. And the Japanese scholars have looked at the kinds of things that can vary. They're only, at least try to boil it down to only certain things about the ranking that differ from one, I guess you might call it stratum, one section of the language to another. So you get structures like that, and that's something that's received a lot of discussion. There's more than one way to try to analyze that. So the co-phonology route is to essentially say that words are sort of tagged as to what branch of the lexicon they're from, and that's indexed to a particular ranking that's used. And then there are other approaches that say that in addition to your universal constraints, they posit that there's a mechanism to posit language-specific constraints that get woven into the ranking that are only active or only evaluate inputs or morphemes that belong to certain classes. And there are pluses and minuses to each of those. That's not something that's a resolved question by any manner. But yes, you can get definitely get phenomena like that. In some cases, it's just sort of a lexical division. There are class 1 vowels and class 2 vowels and class 3 vowels. In other cases, it's more grammatically divided. So if you look at English, for example, you get nouns like object, where stress is initial. And then if you take the verb form with the same phones, what you get is I object. You know, roughly the phones are the same, but the stress is shifted from initial to final. And they're both English words, but it's a little different story in the phonology being played between the nominal phonology for the nouns and the verbal phonology for the verbs.
Okay, so it sounds like dialects. You're describing dialects here, right?
Well, no,
yeah.
that's within one speaker. You know, one matter of speaking, you've got, you know, for me, you know, the nominal form, the noun form is object, and the verb form is object. And that's all in the same manner of speech. You know, my dialect. The distinction is the grammatical one, how the sound feature is tied to the different syntactic functions. And there isn't a lot of that in language, but there is some, enough that you can't just, in the big picture, you can't sweep it under the rug. You know, it's a real thing.
To know, you will need to know if you're looking at a noun or a verb, for example, and then the noun would have one rule and the verbs would have different rules.
It's going to be something like that. However you choose to reflect that, whether you, so one way would be to say that part of being a noun is you have an accent represented in the input. And if you can get the ranking right to respond to that without having, you know, too many other effects where you don't want effects in other parts of the English phonology, then that would be enough to distinguish it. The other way is to have something in the ranking that would be in the constraints that would be sensitive to those different morphosyntactic categories. And that's what would determine the outcome.
Okay.
Again, there are lots of things like that are real phenomena that one has to deal with that I'm not trying to inject into my talk today.
Yeah.
Some of the complexities I could say a lot more about, and some of them correspond to things that are still wide open questions in the field.
Okay. Also, I just wanted to interrupt for a second because there was a commotion here. So just to put everybody on the same page for Van.
So, Bruce, at 6:28 on the 14th of March, MIT releases its admissions results. So it's called Pi Day 3.14. So my son, who is a senior in high school, had applied to MIT, and we just heard that he got in.
Oh, congratulations. Yes, that's worth a little commotion, I suppose.
Yeah, there was a little commotion to 6:30. Yeah.
I couldn't believe how calmly you were sitting here at 6:28 at first.
I mean, Darius has essentially grown up on campus at MIT from his first Halloween was spent in this department. So he had this home. So in his mind, it was there was more emotion attached to this decision than it would be for any other university. So it was helpful.
Yeah. You have to explain what it was like, more motion. Cheers.
Cheers.
Congratulations. Now we see the exception.
Yeah. Cheers. Well, Darius will come in and stay for.
Oh,
Is he nearby?
Sorry?
Is he nearby?
So he won't come in today,
Oh,
but
okay.
soon.
Okay.
Yes.
okay, now we're following again.
Okay, good. So now you have a rough idea what the formal structure is of the space of phonologies and how we're accounting for it with optimality theory in terms of the different rankings of the constraints. So if we think about what's involved in learning, the data that a learner has to learn from in a phonology consists of words built out of morphemes. That's those such forms are organized into paradigms.
We have
Paradigms are
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, this might be a very basic question, but why do you need all to specify the input that comes in? And I guess I'm trying to understand like how this applies to like a person learning to speak a certain language, and where would the inputs be? Because as far as I understand, like the input space is just I guess it's for like the changes from the input to the output. That's where it's important. Does that make sense? I think.
Or in learning the grammar? Like, why do we care about the inputs?
Yeah, why do we care about the inputs? Why couldn't you just put the individual, I guess, morphemes without the or like you could have put pa and ka without any of the accents or length attributes.
well, if you don't specify any of the features that are underlying, then a root is just a root is just a root. And with a function, it will always come out the same. You know, that works if you only have one word in your language. But as soon as you want to have more than one word in your language, it's a problem. So the underlying features are what allow you to specify that different morphemes have different sound properties attached to them. So
Right.
a way of saying that is that they're, among other things, they specify contrast between, you know, the sound properties of one morpheme and the sound properties of another.
Mm-hmm. No. So I guess, well, when you go into that chart, why can't you just start with like the two morphemes, let's say, or the previous one, and just say, okay, it's preferred in this language to have the longest vowel first, so let's put the longest vowel first, and then it's preferred then to have the accent here, so let's have that here. Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Well, in the case of, say, this language, it's not, for instance, it's not always preferred to have the stress first. And it's not even always the case that you have the longest vowel first. It depends on the morpheme you're dealing with. And what makes life interesting for learning is that if we take something like this root, we see that it alternates. So if we look at the surface realization of that root across its paradigm, sometimes it's stressed, like in the first two instances, and sometimes it's not. If we look at, say, suffix S4 here and look across the row here, there are a couple of words where it's both stressed and long, and a couple of words where it's unstressed and short.
So it's not many to one mapping. It's many to many. That's what you need to practice.
So you need a way to distinguish different morphemes from each other, or else they'd all end up sounding the same. So there are general principles, and the way it works is that if it's the case, for instance, in the language, you're dealing with a language like Czech, where stress is always on the first syllable, then we don't want the explanation for that to be, well, every morpheme we create has a stress, just happens to have a stress there. So we want the grammar to enforce that. And that's part of the purpose of saying that the space of possible inputs is the same across all languages. So regularities, the things that are sort of imposed by the phonology, we want in fact to be imposed by the ranking, not just by accidents of what you chose to put in the input and not in the input. And then the importance of specifying things in the input are the things that the phonology has to allow to vary. That is, those dimensions that are used to distinguish one word from another within the language. So that's part of what the learner has to work out. So what does the learner have to learn? Well, they have to learn the map from inputs to outputs, which for us formally is the ranking of the constraints. And they have to learn the underlying forms for the morphemes, what we would call the lexicon. So what the learner actually hears are these outputs. Word R2S1, well, R2S1 sounds like this. Word R2S3, well, word R2S3 sounds like this. In the first one, R2 is stressed and long, and the second one, R2 is unstressed and short. And the learner has to figure out what the underlying form is for R2, along with S1 and S3, and what the function is that's being performed from the inputs to the outputs, such that whatever underlying form you pick for R2 and for S1 and S3, in R2S1, R2 surfaces as stressed as long, and in R2S3, it surfaces as unstressed and short. Now, if a learner started out knowing what all the inputs were, what all the underlying forms were, it turns out to be relatively straightforward to work out what the ranking is. And if the learner already knew what the ranking was, that would be a big help in figuring out what the underlying forms are. But the learner starts out knowing neither. So the two have to be learned together. That is, you have to play the interests of each off of the other and sort of in combination learn. And so that's what's coming in the learning algorithm we'll see is the learner learns a little bit about the ranking, and it's able to use that to learn a few underlying feature values, which then allows it to learn more about the ranking, which then makes it possible to learn some more about the underlying feature values. And it goes back and forth till it's learned both.
And Bruce, sorry, just a quick question. So is the auditory apparatus of the learner, does it privilege one kind of learning over the other in terms of the developmental timeline? Or are both of these things in principle learnable at the same time? Or is it the case that developmental limitations are essentially inducing first one kind of learning and then another kind of learning?
Well, there are aspects. It depends on the aspects of the different kinds of learning. And none of this is completely without controversy, but there have been arguments that have been made that at relatively early stages of learning, by early I mean like well under a year old, children are able to learn certain aspects of the ranking before they've learned enough about the actual words to figure out what the morphemes are and how to decompose the word into the morphemes. Okay, so one thing I'm saying nothing about in the talk today is how a child takes the raw speech signal and figures out where the word boundaries are, which is a quite non-trivial problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also not saying, well, if the child knows which word is which, how do they figure out the morpheme identity? I mean, if something is, the first syllable is stressed and long here and it's unstressed and short here, why do we think it's the same morpheme? There are a combination of things involving cross-situational semantics and the other linguistic context in which the words are that would have to be marshaled together to work that out. And I'm not saying anything about any of that today. There's a lot of that in which there aren't really strong stories to be told. But even in this case, given that, there are arguments that the learner can work out certain aspects of the ranking just on the basic sort of sound structure of what they hear. Not all of the ranking by any means. And I'll allude to that a little bit when I get to actually illustrating how the learner works. So there are aspects of the ranking that are argued to be there. Things that the learner can observe to some extent that there are certain kinds of sounds that simply aren't occurring. In fact, the general argument about the development of phonology is that properties of sounds are organized on markedness scales. So there are some sounds that are pretty much universal. They occur in every language. Those would be the least marked properties. And then there are some that are a little more marked. They occur in many languages, but not all. And then properties that are even more marked, and they're even less common. And children tend to start out in their early production producing only the least marked sounds. Even if they're speaking a language which has a lot of other sounds, they produce only certain sounds, and those happen to be the ones that are cross-linguistically least marked. And then over time, their productions accumulate more and more marked structures. And so a common way to account for that is to say that the child is starting out with a ranking that basically limits the inventory to only the least marked things. And then when you observe more marked structures, the ranking gets adjusted to allow those things into the inventory over time. But that's only part of the ranking information. To get further with the ranking information, you need to know some things about the morphological segmentation of words into morphemes, because you need to start working out things about underlying forms in order to get access to further ranking information. So it's not that one style of learning is across the board privileged over others, but there are certain aspects of information that are appear to be, seem to be more accessible and are actually reflected in acquisition data to at least arguably be acquired earlier.
Thank you.
Sorry for this question. I'm struggling to understand why the dimension reduction has been used for 6 dimensions, because you could argue that you lose a lot of information. So why not using the entire wave pattern and use the entire model and see, because you get all the information from a pattern as well. So the peak at the beginning, the end, the amplitudes, and the sigmoids, the bandwidth, so to speak, of the pattern. So I wonder why reducing? What's the advantage?
Well, so what reduction are you referring to? Are you saying like discretizing the continuous signal?
Yeah, so taking the example here, speaking any word, right, whether it's Paka or learning or phonology, if I speak it, or if anyone speaks it follows a certain pattern, which can be broken down into its single components, here single letters in this sense. So, and the interaction between each of these letters in this case, and it follows a pattern. And I guess the breakdown of the dimensions symbolizes these patterns, right? The height, the pitch at the beginning, pitch at the end, the band of the pronunciation of each letter. The stressor has a larger bandwidth, so to speak. So I wonder why not using a type of model. So in coming from the vision area, and in vision and neuroscience, when we have these nonlinear models, then things like Fourier transform and nonlinear modeling is often being used in order to discern a principal pattern for every given signal, and here in this signal would be any given letter or word.
Okay, so there are a whole bunch of different dimensions to addressing that, but one is that the properties of the speech signal are complex indeed, but the kind of phonological operations clearly, at least one can argue rather strongly, operate over a discretized a set of elements. So when we're talking about the mental operations that are going on into structuring the sound pattern, one can argue that there's an awful lot of phonetic detail that just doesn't appear to be relevant. Exactly where that line is drawn is the subject of very active discussion and research and so forth. But there are lots of reasons to believe that the core phonology itself is a relatively discrete system. One thing that's worth keeping in mind is that there are two ends to what's going on. There is not only the acoustic signal that's being interpreted by the perceptual system, there's also the motor articulator system that's generating sounds. And the phonology is bridging both of those in some sense. It's sort of an abstract thing that feeds both, even though the properties in some ways of the two are very different. And so that reduction into a computational system arguably gives you a more explanatory account of the kinds of patterns we see in the sound, but it also permits it to explain why the way we speak has as much to do as it does with what we hear. Now, does that address what you're asking about?
Yeah, kind of.
The other half of the answer is because I like to be able to actually fit things on my slides and minimize the details for communication and so forth. But
No, I can definitely see that it's useful, but I worry that, the ideas I have here for this would be some probabilistic approach rather than, let's say, dimension reduction. And I'm sure there's probably pros and cons, but, I'm way out of my depth here. So I find this really interesting.
Okay. That at the end, that's a topic we could come back to if you wanted also.
Yeah, thank you.
Because, there are a number of things that can be said about that. So the key thing about here is, in order for learning to succeed, the learner's going to have to figure out how to play the learning of the ranking and the learning of the underlying features off of each other. They interact. The learner has to be able to solve them both together. And so to do that, my argument is that they have to attend in one way or another to two key types of paradigmatic information. Okay, one's called morphemic contrast. And morphemic contrast is particularly useful in identifying underlying feature values. And this gets back to the question of why do we have the underlying features in the first place? So if two words contrast, if their outputs are different, something about their inputs must be different. So, if you're going to have more than one word, there has to be something in the input that's distinguishing them and in a way that's efficaciously leads to their distinct output pronunciations. And so morphemic contrast, if I have two words here, one is R2S1 and one is R2S3, the root is in common. So whatever the underlying form is for the root in the first word, it's also the underlying form in the second word. The suffixes are different, and we see that the pronunciations of the words are different. One's got a stressed long vowel as its first vowel, and the other has a stressed short vowel as the second vowel. So that tells us that there must be something that's different about the underlying forms for the two suffixes that's responsible for the difference in the output of the words there. It can't be something about the underlying form of the root alone, because it's the same underlying form in both cases, because the root is the same. So we know we're getting some kind of evidence there for a distinction in the underlying feature values when we see morphemic contrast in that way. Replace one morpheme with another, get a different output. The other kind of paradigmatic information is alternation, and that's when you see the same morpheme surfacing differently in different environments. So if we take the same pair of words but focus on the root, we see that we have the same root, and in two different environments, it's surfacing differently. Okay, so its underlying form, whatever it is, has to be different from at least one of those surface realizations. If R2 is underlyingly unstressed, then the stress in R2S1 is being imposed by the phonology. And if it's underlyingly stressed, then that stress is being removed. It's getting de-stressed by the phonology in the second word. So that gives us information about the ranking. In particular, when something about the Markness constraints is forcing some kind of change to be made from the input to the output. And so the learner is going to be actively attending to both of those kinds of information because it's endemic to the nature of the problem. If you're trying to work out the joint interactions between the constraint ranking and the underlying forms, you have to attend to the paradigmatic structures, the way that different morphemes are causing outputs to come out differently, and the way that the same morpheme comes out differently in different environments, in different circumstances. So that leads to a problem that one can characterize, but it's a computationally somewhat challenging problem, at least when one initially looks at it. If you try to solve it by brute force, you quickly discover that that's just not possible. The combinatorics are such that if you try to scale up the problem at all from a simple case like this, the number of possible rankings by the number of possible inputs for the different morphemes blows up in your face so rapidly, there's no hope. So we need some kind of further structure for the learner to exploit if learning, in this case, is going to be tractable. And so that's where the theory of output-driven maps comes in. And so this is a property that holds of some maps and not others. And it's a property that's proposed that not all of phonology appears to correspond to, but it's a good first approximation. It's actually remarkable. A lot of phonology seems to adhere to this property. So let me briefly explain what this property is. It's really a kind of, I guess you might call it algebraic convexity. So a map from inputs to outputs is output driven if for every mapping from input A to output X, if there's some other mapping, some other input B to X, let's say candidate, that has greater similarity than A to X, that means that B is in the right way more similar to X than A is, then B must also go to X in the map. So simplifying the language on that a little bit, if it's the grammar maps A to X and B is more similar, closer to X than A is, then that map also maps B to X. So it's sort of a way of saying if you have a way of imposing a kind of distance, it's not quite, distance isn't quite the right word, but I'll explain that further in a minute. And the grammar is willing to go to the effort of mapping A to X, that is imposing enough changes there. And along that path is some other form that's a possible input. It should end up in the same place. You know, if you start closer, you should end up at the same destination. Okay, roughly that's the idea of a map being output driven. And formally, there are maps that are output driven. There are maps that are not output driven. The term output driven comes from a commonly discussed property in phonology that's sort of embodied to a fair extent in optimality theory, that changes that are imposed between the input and the output are overwhelmingly imposed by properties of outputs, things that you want to be true of the output. So this is an attempt to take that intuition and turn it into a formal characterization. What does it mean to say that your map, any changes that are made from the input to the output by the map are motivated by restrictions on what the outputs have to be like? So they're driven by the output. Now, similarity in the form that is relevant here is a relational notion. That is, it's not, you don't get it by adding up the number of differences and saying fewer differences is closer. That runs you off in very much the wrong direction. So we would say we deal with this by identifying the distance or difference between an input and output in terms of disparities. And disparities here means differences in feature values between the input and the output. So if this is A here, and that is X, A goes to X. These are the sort of feature vector representations of those forms. And the values in red are the ones that are different between the input and the output. Those are the disparities. So in A goes to X, there's a disparity in the first vowel in stress, because the first vowel is stressed in the input, but not in the output. And there's a disparity in length in the second vowel, because the second vowel in the input is short, whereas in the output, it's long. So there are two disparities there. We say A goes to X. If we look at B goes to X, where it's the same output but a different input, in this case, there's only one disparity. And crucially, it's an identical corresponding disparity to the one between A and X. So both of them shorten the second vowel, or I should say lengthen the second vowel. It's short underlyingly, and it's long in the output. And so for any given mapping, if the grammar is willing to take A to X, and B has a subset of the disparities to X that A does, so every disparity that B goes to X has, A goes to X has plus something other, then if the map enforces A goes to X, if that's part of the map, that's grammatical, then if the map is output driven, it follows that B must go to X also. Okay, so B is closer in this subset of disparities sense. So if we look at a piece of an output-driven map, all four of these forms here have the same output. We're going to evaluate different mappings, different input-output pairs that have different inputs, all to the same output. So in the first candidate at the top here, there are two disparities. There are disparities of the first vowel in stress, the second vowel in length. The second candidate here has one disparity. It just has a disparity in the length of the second vowel. The third candidate here has one disparity. It's only a disparity in the stress on the first vowel. And then finally, the final candidate is what we would sometimes call an identity mapping. It's zero disparities. The input is identical to the output. And so if we were to look at this as a structure where this is our output, that input, which is identical to the output, clearly has the greatest similarity. You can't get more similar than identity. Okay, these are the middle two candidates. Each of those has lesser similarity than the initial candidate. So the one at the top has greater similarity than the two at this intermediate level. But neither one is more similar than the other because each has a disparity that the other one lacks. And at the bottom, no, I didn't write that quite right. That should be. Is the candidate with two disparities. And what we get for the similarity relation is actually a lattice. So if this candidate is mapped to our given output, anything above it, which has greater similarity, must also go to the same output. Anything below it, we don't know. So if this candidate is, we have evidence, empirical evidence that tells us that that maps to the output, we know that this input up above it also maps to the same output. We don't know that for this candidate over here because it's not above the one on the left in the similarity order. If we blow this out for all four features, then relative to a particular output, we get the entire relative similarity relation, which in this case is a lattice. So this is our output. The top is the input that has zero disparities. It's identical to that output. That's as similar as you can get. So up is greater similarity. This row here represents an input that has a single disparity. So this is a disparity in the first feature, i.e. stress on the first vowel. This is only a disparity in the second feature, length on the first vowel. A disparity in stress on the second vowel, a disparity in length on the second vowel. And then as you work your way down, this row are all inputs that have two disparities. So if I pick this disparity labeled A here, that has two disparities. If I have data that tells me that that input, A goes to output X, where that's X there, what do I know from that about the map? If I know that A goes to X, then I know that every input above A in the similarity relation that's closer to X in this sense also maps to X. Okay, so in an output-driven map, whether or not an input is required to go to an output is, with regard to similarity, upward entailing. You know that a particular input goes to an output, then anything above it must also map to the same output. If you're willing to introduce two disparities to get to the output, then you should be willing to introduce just one of them. Now, if you're not so used to reading that small print with accents and colons and so forth, here it is just represented as, you know, a four-dimensional feature vector. Your top is your input that has zero disparity, so no red features there. The next row down, each of those forms has a disparity in exactly one feature. Next one below it, there are disparities in two features, the two red possibilities. So you get to the very bottom. This is as unsimilar as you can get. Every feature is different. So with regard to any particular output, the notion of a map being output driven imposes a kind of structure on the space of possible inputs relative to that output. And we will see that that kind of structure has a big impact on how learning can unfold. So it has an impact on both the learning of underlying feature values and on ranking information. And the primary benefit is computational efficiency. And by that, I mean that it converts in key stages exponential search to linear search. Okay, so it greatly reduces the amount of work, the number of forms that have to be evaluated to come to a conclusion in the process of learning. So let me go ahead and get started with an example. So this is going to be taking, I'll illustrate the way the learner works by simply taking the data of L20 and see what the learner does. So to get started, the learner engages in what is phonotactic learning. And so the learner is going to observe the outputs for each word. You know, R1S2, here's its output. For instance, it sees this, that's a word it hears in the language. And it's going to start with the assumption that that form maps to itself. If we adopt it as input, it will map to that output. We're not committing to any features in the lexicon yet. We're just saying, well, regardless of what the actual input is for that word, it must be the case that this particular input must map to that output.
Bruce, sorry, just a quick point. So some of us, and perhaps you as well, we tend to end around 7:15.
Okay.
If it's about 10 more minutes, would that work?
I can try to accelerate. There's actually in terms of what's prepared, quite a bit more to go, but I can jump to the highlight version of it.
Yeah, I hate
pick and choose.
At the same time, I want to make sure that we don't lean too heavily on your time and people here who are sitting here without having had much to eat.
Yep. I had a feeling that was going to happen. I scrunched it as best I could, but I have an idea how to jump forward here. So,
well, we have been delaying you with all of our questions as well.
So, the thinking here is that this is your space of possible inputs. One of them is the correct input for the word that you heard. But whichever one it is, any input that's above it must also map to the same output. And so no matter which one of these you pick that goes to that output, the top, the maximum similar one, must also go to that output. So this first stage follows directly. It predates the theory. The use of this greatly predates the development of the theory of output-driven maps, but it follows automatically as a consequence of that. So given the assumption that input maps to that output, the learner is then going to learn something about the ranking that must be true by saying, okay, I have this input. What I heard, the actual data I have, is an output. So select a different candidate and you learn what must be true of the ranking for what you actually heard, what we call the winner, to do better than the loser, the thing that must lose to it in the competition. And so in this case, we get some ranking information out of that. And you follow through completely on that. Just for each word you hear, taking the identical input and mapping to it, you can learn some things about the ranking. There are a number of other things that you can't learn. So we've learned that much about the ranking. The learner knows what the morphemes are, but they don't have any idea at the outset what the feature values are. So each question mark you see here indicates a feature, and it indicates that it doesn't know what the value is for the feature yet. They're all unset. And so the learner has to go about learning more about the ranking and setting the features. So the key to figuring out how to set the features is that if you can figure out that no underlying form with a feature set one way could possibly give you the output you want, then that feature must have the other value. And for this, we're going to take output-driven maps and take the idea and run it in its logically equivalent contrapositive form. If B can't map to X, then nothing below it can map to X. Okay, it's just the contrapositive form of if A maps to X, then B maps to X. That can be used to evaluate individual features in an attempt to set them. So if we observe the word R1S4, sounds like this. We don't know what the actual value of the underlying length feature of the second vowel, suffix S4, is. So we're going to introduce an input for evaluation purposes that differs in just that one feature. So the output that we heard, try setting or having the value opposite of that value, having it shorten the input, and see if that crashes or not. And so in this case, if you create that pair and see what it tells you about the ranking, it tells you something impossible. Basically, it tells you that there are constraints that have to be dominated, but it wouldn't matter how you rank things, nothing relevant could dominate them. So we know that if we pick that input with the, and all we changed was that vowel set to short, you can't get there from here, given what the learner already knows about the ranking. They've learned enough about the ranking at that first stage to figure out that that's not a possible input. And this is efficient because we're using, again, the structure of output-driven maps. So all of the shaded circles here represent all of the inputs where that second vowel is short. Its value is set to minus long. So if that value were to be minus long, the input would have to be one of those. Notice they form a sublattice. So we go to the top of the sublattice, and that's the form we constructed, that we actually created. And we determined that that input can't get to the output. Okay, with the information we know about the ranking tells us that there's no ranking available that'll get us there. The structure of output-driven maps tells us, well, if that can't be the input, nothing below it, that is, none of the other shaded forms, can be the input either. And if none of them can be the input, then of the viable inputs that remain, none of them have that second vowel short. So of the unshaded inputs, we don't know which one's the correct input, but we do know that that length feature of S4 must be long, because none of the inputs will work. The key thing here is that that sublattice, which has 8 elements, was evaluated by only picking the top member and evaluating it. This is where the exponential to linear search comes in. You say, okay, we need more than 2 features. We're going to add a lot more features and have longer words. This lattice blows up exponentially, which means that all of the different inputs that have a particular feature set to a particular value, that sublattice is much bigger. What does it take for me to evaluate that? I evaluate one point, the one at the very top of the sublattice. So it completely undercuts that exponential growth. So if I want to test each of the features to see if I can set them for the input for this form, well, I test that last feature by testing that input. If I want to test the stress feature for that suffix, I test that one, and the length feature for the root, that one, and the stress feature for the root, that one. So however many features there are that I want to try to set, I evaluate one alternative input for each feature. And if they're inconsistent, I can set the feature. If they're not inconsistent, then I can't set it right now. I don't have the information to tell me. No need to try the exponentially growing number of other possible inputs further down in the lattice. So testing, evaluating the features in this way to see what can be set is linear in the number of features, even though the number of inputs grows rapidly. So once you've set an underlying feature, then it's time for morphemic alternation to come in, because once you've seen a feature and you've set a feature because you've seen a place where it has to surface correctly, if that feature alternates, that is, that same morpheme, you use it in a different word, the feature value surfaces differently, that's evidence for activity of the phonology, which tells you information about the ranking. So we saw S4 is long in a word where it surfaced long. Now we look at a word with a different root and it surfaces as short. And so we're going to evaluate a particular input for that. We don't know either the feature values for R3. We don't know the stress feature for S4, but we know the length feature. So there's the lattice of inputs for that output for R3, S4, but we know that S4 must be long. So the shaded diamonds you see there are the ones that are inconsistent with that value we set in the input. They're no longer on the table. Okay, we've eliminated those by figuring out how to set that underlying feature for the suffix, which means the remaining ones, possible inputs, well, they form a sublattice. And we don't know which of those inputs is the correct one, but we know whichever one it is, the top one, the ranking must map that to the output. Again, that's output drivenness. There's a lot we don't know about the input. We know what the actual underlying feature values are, but we know that this input must map to that output. And so for purposes of learning the ranking, we can use that mapping, which gives us some more information about the ranking. And that's how the learner works from there. It ends up with uncovering, step by step, the correct ranking. And the lexicon is correct. It sets all but two features. The length features for two suffixes never get set. And the reason for that is hidden back in the data that we saw. They never surface differently. When we generated things, we hypothesized S1 and S2 as one as being short, the other being long. But they're both minus stress and their suffixes, so stress never shows up on them. And if they aren't stressed, the vowel shortens, whether it's underlyingly long or not. So they always surface the same. So in the surface data, there's no way to distinguish them. They don't contrast. Whether you set the underlying length feature for that suffix to short or long, in every environment, it comes out the same. So there's no contrast there to be realized. It wouldn't matter which feature you set it to. So the learner just leaves it unset. It never has evidence that tells us it has to be set one way or the other, because it doesn't matter in a sense. If we look at the outline of how learning unfolds here, this is what's going on. We learn some basic ranking information just from mapping, identity mappings, taking each output, saying, well, it must map to itself. From that, we're able to set an underlying feature, which then allowed us to obtain some further ranking information. That further ranking information bought us a bunch more underlying feature values. Okay, there was enough byte there that we were able, in the ranking, that we were able to set a lot of those feature values. And a couple of critical feature values were set that allowed the learner, through, again, a particular observation of paradigmatic data, to work out further ranking information. That allows then the learner to set a number of additional underlying features and then learn the last piece of ranking information. Okay, so that interleaving process goes all the way through. And I would argue that's how it has to be. The two things have to be played off each other, and they're sort of learned simultaneously, the ranking information and the underlying feature values. So if we look at what's making learning possible here, optimality theory, this is something of a simplification, imposes structure on the space of constraint rankings that we can use. The fact that it's based on strict domination, different possible rankings of the constraints, means that even though the space of possible rankings grows as a factorial function, from data we can train in on the right ranking very efficiently, very rapidly. The theory of output-driven maps imposes structure on the space of underlying forms, which allows, again, computationally for the learner to identify correct underlying feature values very quickly. Because even when the space of possibilities grows exponentially, using the lattice structure that's imposed on the space of possible inputs, you can evaluate one input and it acts as a proxy for an entire sublattice. The only work you have to do is evaluate the top of it. And so the learner is crucially exploiting both types of structure. So for conclusions, the structure imposed by output-driven maps makes much more efficient learning possible. The key to the success of the learning algorithm here is jointly leveraging the two forms of paradigmatic information. Okay, you have these two forms which require the relationships of the forms across different environments in different places. And this leads to one of the guiding principles that's sort of been behind my career, which is that if you do it right, the needs of learning theory and the needs of linguistic theory don't need to be antagonistic, which was the state of the field when I first encountered it. If you get them right, then they're mutually beneficial. The things that make for a better linguistic theory give you the tools to work with to come up with a better learning theory, and vice versa. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. This was fantastic. This is, to be completely honest, this is the first talk on this material that I have attended. So most of the talks I attend are in vision. So this was, I learned so much. Thank you. And you have a talent for explaining things very clearly.
Oh, thank you.
This was really wonderful. Thank you for spending the time with us.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed the questions. So, and I will say, Rutgers and the Cognitive Science Center affiliated with it, is a very strong sort of vision group. And I've sat in on more than a few vision talks over the past, close to 30 years now. And often I don't follow everything that's going on, but I've learned quite a bit over the years. And I've even encountered some things in vision that have overlap, at an abstract level with some of these sorts of things. In particular, there are some things about higher level vision that Jacob Feldman's worked on.
Yeah.
Identifying the most plausible interpretation involving optimization over certain features. And it's not the same thing, but we both identify that it's in the same ballpark. It's like the same style of computation. And I think when you see convergences like that, it's evidence that the field as a whole is headed in the right directions.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, even the point you were making about how a learning task that on surface looks exponentially or has exponential complexity, how it can be brought down to something that's linear. There are many such problems in vision where the learning task is NP hard, but the brain does it.
Yep.
And how the brain does it. What are the kinds of constraints the brain uses in order to overcome the NP hardness of the.
Yep.
Yeah, so this was very, very illuminating. Thank you again.